Michael, thank you so much for coming in today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm just so glad that you're on the program today because I know there's a lot of people that are struggling with issues around atheism, and they might not know who Ayn Rand is, and we want to tell them all about that today and your book, Reconsidering Ayn Rand. Why don't you tell everyone first your background?
Yes, thanks, Daniel. I'm a pediatric ophthalmologist. I also practice general ophthalmology. So I'm a physician, surgeon, and I was born in the United States, lived in Taiwan for about 8 years, grew up in the United States from the time I was 8 on, lived in the South, went to school at Johns Hopkins University for undergraduate, then at Harvard Medical School, and then went on to ophthalmology residency and training in pediatric ophthalmology. And I was at Cincinnati Children's Hospital for 21 years as a division director in pediatric ophthalmology. I left last August 2023 to start my own practice. And I grew up an atheist since about the time I was in high school, 14 years of age, and became a Christian when I was in my first year in medical school at Harvard.
Thanks so much for sharing that. We've had a chance to kayak a little bit together, get to know each other, go out to breakfast. So it's just been so good getting to know you and your story. You mentioned you became a Christian in Harvard Medical School, correct?
Correct.
But before that, you really were into Ayn Rand.
That's right.
And she's a very popular author. A lot of people would say that she is actually the most influential author aside from maybe perhaps the Bible.
That's
Is that correct?
That's correct. I grew up possibly having a little bit of exposure to church. And then at 13 or 14, some things happened to me in high school or junior high school that probably made me a little bit vulnerable to certain viewpoints that would allow me to strengthen my resolve. And I think I found that in the writings of Ayn Rand. I was exposed first because there were some seniors when I was a freshman in high school who were talking about her works. And so out of curiosity, I just bought a copy of the book and started reading.
Okay.
And she's a philosopher, but she is actually more well-known as a fiction writer, a novelist. And she wrote 2 best-selling books, The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged.
Okay.
And Atlas Shrugged was what I started off with. And I was hooked upon starting to read it because it portrayed these stories of these incredibly high-achieving characters and contrasted them with these villains who just seemed like they were really pathetic and not supposed to be emulated. So you mentioned that she's perhaps one of the most influential writers of the 20th century, and she was found on a Library of Congress survey. It was a combined survey between the Book of the Month Club and the Library of Congress in about 1991, I believe, and found that she was her book Atlas Shrugged was second only to the Bible in terms of its impact on people's lives.
Wow.
So now it was a big gap between the Bible and her book.
Okay.
And her book was a close, there was like a cluster of 5 books that were very, very close to each other. But hers did come out on top in that cluster of 4 or 5 books.
It's very impressive.
Yes. And so she is well known in the conservative circles. I just remember back in the Great Recession of 2008 that all the conservative news outlets would be talking about her and her influence on folks like Paul Ryan and other conservatives. And there would be questions such as, is Atlas shrugging? So, the title of her book is Atlas Shrugged, and it's based on this idea that Atlas, who holds up the world, and the giant who holds up the world in Greek mythology, what if he were to shrug? The whole world would just slide down his shoulders and fall apart. So there was this idea that is Atlas shrugging now, because she depicted a scenario near the end of her book where all the productive men are either hamstrung or just decide to give up. And because the world depends on those productive folks, it can't run very long without them. Common labor, as valuable as that is, if there's no direction given to it, would just be misdirected and not be as productive. So that's the idea.
So you're a senior in high school, or you're in school, you discover this book and something grabs you from it, right?
Correct.
The different stories, the different characters. What would you say, maybe 1 or 2 things that just seem to pull you in and say, boy, this is really what I want to follow after?
The stories stand on their own. The stories stand on their own. There's a character in particular named Francisco d'Anconia, who's like the heir apparent to this copper empire. And he could just do things so easily, whether it's intellectual or physical. On his first try American baseball, he hit he hit home run, and he could just do things better than anybody else. And so you just kind of aspire to be like that person, even though you can't actually do all those things. But at least intellectually, I felt like I could accomplish a lot. So, and then these folks didn't really apologize for how good they were. And so they didn't brag about it, but they just kind of did it, and they didn't really care if anybody was envious of them. And I suppose at that time in high school, I needed a little bit of that. In addition to the story standing on their own, I personally needed it because I was going through some difficult challenges there with interactions with classmates and so on and so forth. And so I needed to be able to kind of take that philosophy and make it my own and kind of look around and say, well, I don't care what you think, and I'm just going to do the best I can do, and I don't care. So that was kind of my attitude, and this philosophy, this way of viewing the world did actually embolden me to continue in that way and to achieve despite folks who may not have been all that supportive.
So in her book, and what her book describes, from what I understand, is objectivism. Is that correct?
Correct.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So people find their way to her philosophy, which is called objectivism, through the fiction for the most part. Folks don't usually read her nonfiction and then say, "Oh, this is the philosophy I want." They are enticed by what life could be based on the fiction, and so then they go on to read her nonfiction works, because after she wrote her novels, she started to write some nonfiction works, essays and things of that nature, and then they were compiled into books. So objectivism is the idea that there's an objective reality that's independent of your or my wishes about it, or your or my thoughts about it. We need to kind of conform our thoughts to this objective reality, and objective reality can be discerned and it can be discovered. So she wrote a few books. The two most famous ones are the Virtue of Selfishness and Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. Every philosophy has different levels in it. I mean, you start off with a theory of knowledge, like how do you know anything, right? Because for you to say anything about morality, you need to actually first know how you know. The second thing is metaphysics. So the theory of knowledge is called epistemology, but the theory of reality is called metaphysics. And so how do you know that this world is made out of hard, solid atoms and material, or is it just kind of an illusion? How do you know any of those things? That's the theory of knowledge is epistemology, and metaphysics is what is reality actually made of. And then the next two are more practical branches, which is ethics, the theory of morality. How do you act? What's right and wrong action? What are right and wrong actions? And then finally would be politics. So a theory of government. What's our relationship to each other? What are rights? What are expectations in terms of your behavior in a society?
So obviously something drew you in there. You shared that with us, but then you started to kind of live it out, didn't you? You started to live out what you learned in the books. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, so as I mentioned before, it gave me permission to pursue my self-interest. And to not apologize for that. Now, there's a fine line between being self-interested and being selfish. And subsequently, I came to that understanding. But at the time, as a 14, 15-year-old, there's probably not a huge distinction between that. So it gave me permission to pursue what I wanted to achieve in life, and then again, to ignore the naysayers and the folks who didn't seem to be supportive of that. But the byproduct of that was that I became an atheist. I think that's probably one of your questions, is that she was an atheist, so she didn't believe in God. She didn't believe God existed, and she actually believed that she had reasons to believe that it was impossible for a God to exist. So there were some other authors. Chief of them was a fellow by the name of George Smith, who wrote a book called Atheism, the Case Against God. And so people who would read Ayn Rand's materials would then read some offshoots, some other books that other people had produced. And one of them was this book, Atheism. So I read it, at 14 or 15 years of age, and I went through the entire book and thought I understood it, thought I understood all the arguments against the existence of God, and came to that conclusion. I became an atheist. So I may have been functionally an atheist or a kind of a nominal Christian or nominal believer in God prior to that, but after reading her works and George Smith's works, I became a definite atheist, and I carried that forward until I, through high school, through college, until I got to medical school.
That's really fascinating to me that this book had such a profound effect on your life. And I want to probe just a little bit more and understand, how did that move you towards atheism, if I could?
Sure. I think in several ways. One was that there was this argument that the atheist is not obligated to prove that there is no God.
Okay.
So they put all the proof, the burden of proof, on the theist, the person who purports to believe that there is a God. So the argument that Smith would make is that everybody who does not believe, every person who does not believe that God exists is by default an atheist.
Okay.
Because they lack a belief in God. But beyond that, you can also be an anti-theist, which is somebody who specifically denies that God can exist or that there is a God.
Okay.
It's not simply an absence of belief, like I don't know, or maybe there is, or maybe there isn't. And that's an agnostic, I guess, more so. But if you simply lack a belief and you don't want to bother with it, you're an atheist. And but you can be an anti-theist, like somebody like a Richard Dawkins or somebody like that, who specifically argues that there can't be a God. And so I just thought, okay, well, the burden of proof is on the Christian to produce, a cogent argument for the existence of God. But it turns out that philosophically, it's not quite that simple. Because first of all, for you to say that there isn't a God, think about that. You would have to actually know everything that there is to know that there isn't a God. You would have to be so powerful, perhaps all powerful, to prevent a God from existing. And then you have to know everything. Okay. And you have to be everywhere in order to be able to observe or to come to the conclusion that there isn't a God. So think about that. And basically now you are God. So you've contradicted yourself. For you to be able to say universally, what's called a universal negative in philosophy, you would have to actually know everything, or you would have to come up with some kind of rational proof that actually demonstrates that beyond the shadow of a doubt. So that's a contradiction that I wasn't aware of in my immaturity at 14. Even though I thought I was pretty smart, I wasn't nearly smart enough. The other thing is that these folks are empiricists. Empiricists in philosophy is somebody who claims to obtain knowledge by sensation.
Okay.
So if you're going to observe, if you're going to sense, sensations and observations are always limited. You can never sense everything or observe every event in the entire world in order to come up with the idea that, I've looked everywhere, there isn't a God. So that's a basic flaw with that position coming from an empiricist, to believe that they can actually demonstrate that there isn't a God. The second thing is that every system of thought actually has its own gods, so to speak, because God is actually, if you think carefully about it, is actually your basic principle. Okay, so the atheist or the Ayn Rand devotee has two gods. One is they believe in materialism, indestructible matter, objective reality, and the second is autonomous human reason, that they can actually use their sensation, their observations, in order to derive valid conclusions. So those are their two basic axioms.
Okay.
They're two basic beliefs. If you think back to high school geometry, you reason starting with basic unprovable assumptions. And so they assume those things. They can't prove them, but they assume those things and they reason from them. And because they assume those things, those are their axioms. You too have an axiom. Your axiom, if you're a Christian, is that the Bible alone is the Word of God. Okay, you can't fully prove it. You have some evidences, historical consistency and things of that nature, that allows you to have pretty high confidence in it. But ultimately, God has to persuade you that this is your basis. the basis from which you reason and come to your conclusions. And reasoning by good and necessary consequences, as one of the great confessions of Protestantism says, this is the Westminster Confession, reasoning by good and necessary consequences from the Scripture to derive truth. So, so the idea here is that it's not neutral.
Okay.
Every system of thought, whether you're a Hindu, whether you're a Buddhist, whether you're a Muslim, whether you're an atheist, whether you're agnostic, you start with some unproven presupposition. And so it's not a simple matter to say my view is by default is true, and you, Christian, has to prove your point of view. Every system has a starting point, a God, and every system has to derive its system of thought and interact with the other systems in order to argue, discuss, and persuade. So my views in high school were a little bit simplistic.
Thanks so much for sharing about how that really changed your life, and also how it seemed to really speak to where you were at that time in life. I really see that in our world right now, where people are kind of letting go of God. They're letting go of what other people think of them or what other people think they should do, and they're following their own path. And there's something that is really motivating about that, really freeing about that. What do you think it is right now in our world that so many people are drifting that way?
I think that, first of all, to take a step back, that if you were to ask the Ayn Rand devotee today, their official position would be, see, the world is going down this terrible pathway, and we offer a solution because we believe in objective morality. So as atheists, they're kind of unique in that objectivism actually believes in a system of absolute rights and wrongs. Most atheists aren't like that. And the problem, though, is that how do they defend those absolute rights and wrongs? A lot of folks like Ayn Rand because of the practical outcome in the realm of morality. They do believe in productive work and not lying and not stealing and things of that nature. And in the realm of politics, they also believe in capitalism, the free market, limited government. And so a lot of conservatives can latch onto those ideas. But the problem is that philosophically, they don't really have the right to that absolute morality. Because, as I mentioned earlier, epistemology, which is the theory of knowledge, is how you then eventually come up with how do you know which morality is correct. And if you look at their system, without going into too great of details, it's ultimately based on sensation and observation. So they talk about the sensation of good, the sensation of pleasure being how you come up with the idea of what is good for you. And then they might then talk about a higher order of emotional happiness as being the indication of what's good for you. But if we choose, as our guide, the sensations of pleasure and pain, in order to determine what is good versus evil, then how does that differentiate objectivism from hedonism? Because hedonism is based on the idea of what gives you pleasure, what gives you pain. And utilitarianism, for example, in the realm of politics, might be talking about the greatest good for the greatest number of people, the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number of people. And so what you find is that objectivism has to sneak in the back door some ideas about this standard or this quality of life, man qua man. That's how they define it, which means man the way he actually is supposed to be. But then how do you know what he's supposed to be, right? On the one hand, you have this idea that the standard is man as he's supposed to be, but on the other hand, you're saying, well, you just look at the sensations of pleasure and pain. So it's a bit of a contradiction. They kind of sneak in the back door, this idea of man being this highest type of person. And then in that situation, you have to ask, well, if he's behaving like the highest type of person, then what happens when he experiences pain? Does he then ignore the pain and keep pressing on by his principles? Or does he then give in to the pain and say, well, pain must mean this is bad, so I'm not going to pursue this because clearly I'm pursuing my principles. I get persecuted or I get roadblocks in my, there's this scene in Atlas Shrugged where Francisco d'Anconia has to cope with the loss of his loved one. And I'm sure he experienced pain, but he pressed on towards that ideal that he was instructed by his friend John Galt and gave up the woman that he loved. And so at that moment, was he pursuing pleasure or was he pursuing pain? He was pursuing pain because of the principle. Okay, so that's a bit of a contradiction. But to speak to what you were talking about earlier, if ultimately your decision is based on pleasure and pain as to what is good or bad, you're eventually going to jettison the principle. Okay, or you can stay with the principle, but then you're not really following the morality that Ayn Rand set up for you. So, but with respect to our society, what you find is that most empiricists, most folks who go by what their observations are, they pursue pleasure and pain. So if I feel like it's good for me, to pursue a certain pathway, whether it's, if I find pleasure in, having a particular thought process or identity politics, or if I just feel like I'm a different person, I'm a transgender kind of a person or something like that, I can pursue that because it makes me feel good until it doesn't.
Right.
Because as you might know, there are a lot of detransitioners, folks who are now regretting their decision that they made earlier on. And if they were going by pleasure, by what made them feel good, they're going to go down that pathway. It may make you feel good to steal, right? And then so why is stealing then bad? Because I get pleasure out of stealing, or I get pleasure out of doing any kind of thing. So I think our society is going down that pathway because it too has this philosophy of what makes me feel good,
right,
as its guide, rather than principles that are revealed in Scripture by an all-knowing God, and based on the Ten Commandments and other deductions or that you can make from those principles. Ayn Rand's followers are trying to hold the line. They can't really do it ultimately because it's contradicted by their fundamental assumptions.
It almost seems like they would be able to hold the line for a little while, right?
Right.
Like freedom just feels so good. It's like you're taking off this large coat of people telling you what to do, or society or God, and it just feels great to do whatever you want. But there's a consequence. And we see that in society. We see that, I think, in our own lives too, even for us who are Christians, making decisions that are against God might feel good temporarily, but ultimately there is a consequence.
Right. Because I think when you tell a lie to yourself or to other people, it eventually catches up with you. And at some point you tell so many lies that they conflict, and you have to tell more lies. You tell a small lie first, then you got to cover up that lie, whether it's to yourself or to other people.
True.
You got to make up another story to kind of justify your initial lie. And then at some point, you don't actually know what reality is because you've told so many lies. People have shown that when a habitual liar lies so many times, they can't actually tell the difference between what's true and what they just made up. And then, as somebody else has said, the balance books of, I guess, morality or spirituality don't lie, just as they don't lie in the area of finances or your checking account.
There we go.
So, but that's I think the folks who follow Ayn Rand can hold the line for a little bit, but at some point it does catch up. For me, it caught up in medical school. I don't know why I hadn't thought about it. I think it's easy when you're younger to just kind of cavalierly talk about death. Say, oh, death is no big deal. This guy, I think it was George Smith, who said something like, well, you've got to get used to it because the universe won't hold a funeral for you tomorrow if you die. That's the perspective of an atheist. Okay. And then if you think about it more carefully, well, if you're just atoms and quarks passing through this universe, what's 70 years, what's 100 years? You're just destined to be food for the worms, and you'll dissolve back into the elements of the universe. So what kind of meaning can you derive from that in terms of trying to seek after, good principles like productive work? You're a worm. You've got a fleeting existence, and so why wouldn't it make sense for you to just get whatever you want to get out of it? But So,
yeah, and I have seen that atheist argument, which is actually pretty good. You know, they say, well, of course we care because this is the only life that we have to live. So live at your best, right? That's kind of what the atheist would say to that argument. But speaking of lies and truth, you were really discovering truth. You were looking for truth when you read Ayn Rand. You were looking for something to help you through life. And then you started to notice like the cracks, right? The cracks in the philosophy, the cracks in the thinking. Tell me about that first crack that you noticed and you went, wait a second, this doesn't quite make sense.
Yeah, I think holding to an absolute morality, starting going through college, some things I held dear, some principles I held dear. I probably started to wonder like, well, couldn't I bend the rules there a little bit with that? So that was one area. Then what I just referred to in terms of the universe not holding a funeral for you if you die, I had this experience where I was on an airplane where it was being buffeted quite a bit by the winds. And there was this sense that, well, is this plane going to crash? And so you have this reality that, am I going to die? And then I had just been on the verge of great achievement, getting to the medical school that I wanted to potentially, and feeling like my future is set. But then you get this sense, well, what if I died? What would all that have meant, and who's going to care? Then I was actually fortunate to get into medical school at Harvard, and then we were dissecting, the cadavers during anatomy lab, and then I had to wonder, well, where is this person now? I'm very grateful that this person consented to have their bodies made available to teach future medical students, but where is this person now? They're not here in this preserved corpse, this cadaver. Where are they? Are they gone? Are they dissolved into the material, elements of the universe, or is there a spiritual realm where they truly are? So all these things started to impinge upon my thoughts when I was in the first year of medical school. Also, just starting to realize that the selfishness I had, that I actually had hurt people. So if you think about it, if you're in an atheist universe, there's no right or wrong. What does it matter that I hurt anybody? As long as I don't get caught.
If we're all just meat sacks, floating through the universe, what does it matter what we do, right?
That's right. What if as long as I don't feel pain from some kind of retribution or punishment from somebody, but even then, there's some people who say it's better to have glory in a short period of your life. There's no point in trying to live a long life. I mean, just live a short life and just be a blaze of glory and shoot to the top. Even people like Achilles in the Trojan War, they had that view, in ancient Greece, that what really matters is that you live on in legends, right? Right. The mythology, and people sing of your praises for thousands of years because you're going to die. And so it doesn't matter that you get killed when you're 30 fighting a war.
So the goal was be a legend.
That's right, be a legend.
Go all out.
Yeah, that's right. Because if you live to 70 and nobody knows about you, who cares? But even that doesn't matter, right? Because it's just an illusion. I think that's one of the other things is just thinking about thought. Like if thought was really just the motion of electrons, these neurological impulses that go through your nervous system. So where is truth? Where is morality? Because the thought, first of all, the appearance of a thought. Okay, so there's this terminology called an epiphenomenon. Okay, which is that the phenomena that you're experiencing or thinking is actually what it is isn't really there.
Every time we hang out, I learn new words, by the way. Okay. Keep going. Yeah.
But it's, the reality is that according to modern science, atheistic science, that your thought is really just the motion of electrons in your brain. And so if you think about it, first of all, no two impulses or trains of electronic impulses in your brain, neurological impulses in your brain is ever the same. So if it's not the same, then where do you have this fixed thought? Okay, it could be thought 1, thought 2, thought 3. Okay, that's in your own mind. We're talking right now. I have a thought 1, you have a thought 2. Maybe my thought 1 is that stealing is right, and your thought 2 is that stealing is wrong. But it's just a train of impulses. So if it's just a train of impulses, there's nothing right or wrong about impulses. There's nothing right or wrong about emotion that leads to somebody feeling happy versus a emotion that leads to their death and people being sorrowful. So there is no truth from that perspective if you're a materialist, because it's just the motion of electrons. It's just the given. You have no way of discerning which one is correct or not. So that's another argument against atheism, is that atheists seem to be very desirous of the notion of truth, but they can't justify it on their materialist first principle, because there is no such thing as truth. There's just neurological impulses moving around.
Yep.
And then even then they exhibit, or they tell you that they have a preference for one or the other. But how do you justify that one is more true than the other?
They're lacking the foundation, correct? They're
correct.
Lacking the foundation of right or wrong, and they're kind of stealing, if you will, from the Christian perspective.
That's correct. That's right. You have to have some spiritual realm, some notion of logic as being eternal, and that it encompasses all human beings, that they all share in the same logic before you can even have a conversation. I'm not going to say, well, because you have the wrong philosophy, I'm not even going to talk to you because you're contradicting yourself. But no, I can have a conversation with you, recognizing that within you is implanted the image of God. Even though you're a non-believer, I can still engage with you. But that's my philosophy, that I know that you have that image of God. Whereas in your philosophy, you don't even really know that there's anything such as conversation or truth or anything like that.
In your book, Reconsidering Ayn Rand, there's a really neat story that you tell when you're on an airplane. And I think it had a lot to do with the beginning of you questioning the philosophies of Ayn Rand. Why don't you read from that?
Sure. As I leaned my head against the cabin wall, I saw raindrops dance their way across the window pane. Turbulence made this the roughest flight that I had ever experienced, but I was dozing off to sleep from the weariness of the journey. I was returning to Baltimore from what I hope was a successful medical school interview in Boston in December of 1987. Whatever the outcome of my application to Harvard, I had already been accepted to another prestigious institution. I told myself that I need not worry. As I entered that netherland between consciousness and sleep, I found myself wondering about the meaning of it all. I was 20 years old. I had accomplished much. My future looked to be as challenging and fulfilling as I could have hoped for. But as the winter winds of the northeast corridor shoved the plane incessantly, I wondered what would happen if the plane crashed and I perished. All those years of dedicated study and effort wasted. What would be the meaning of it all? As a non-believer once said, the universe won't stop and hold a funeral for you if you die tomorrow. Life is what we make of it. But even that seemed too optimistic. What meaning could there be in all of our lives if ultimately we were destined to be food for the worms? With that comforting thought, I fell asleep.
I love that writing. You did such a good job on that. The book is just full of awesome arguments, full of really good information on reconsidering Ayn Rand, and then these really neat stories that go along with it. So I hope people check it out. But tell me more about this process that you went through, because you discovered Ayn Rand in a time when you felt you needed those philosophies. You needed those characters to be a part of your life. And then you began to solve these cracks, and you had these big questions like, what happens to me when I die? Or you're working on that cadaver and you're wondering, where is this person? Tell us a little bit more about how you went from being an atheist and a follower of Ayn Rand's philosophies to then discovering these different cracks, different questions, and what happened next.
Yes. So those big questions of life start to make you wonder if atheism was sufficient to prepare you for the continued journey in your life. You wonder because you're starting medical school. Well, I hope to help other people, but to exist to help other people actually isn't actually part of Ayn Rand's vocabulary. She would actually say that, well, you want to practice your craft and you have other people, and if you help them, it's kind of a side product of the fact that you're trying to practice your craft of productive work. So, but I had to ask that question because that was a more important question. It's fundamentally about existence and whether your life should even go on, continue, before you can continue that pathway to actually try to spend years studying to help other people. I think there was also the recognition that, so if I hurt other people, oh, is it just a mistake, unfortunate mistake, or is that actually, as this Bible talks about, sin?
Mm-hmm.
So for various reasons, I had been encouraged to, or had instances where I read parts of the Bible or was encouraged to investigate further, thinking that I had all figured out because of my history of reading Ayn Rand and atheism, that I said, okay, I'll take on that challenge. Maybe I'll read the scriptures a little bit more than I had in the past. I actually never read it in any extensive detail, just read various passages that pertain to various specific issues. And so I started to read the scriptures. I had a narrow miss because I was actually looking for somebody to help me read the scriptures, and I happened to pick a person who was actually part of a cult. But nevertheless, the person who was part of a cult got me started on how to kind of read the scriptures. And then at some point, just reading the scriptures, I realized that what he was advocating was not correct according to the scriptures. God was merciful in that way. And then so I declined any further help from that person and moved on. So I started to get an idea of what Jesus was talking about, talking about sin leading to death. And what does it profit a man to gain the whole world but lose his own soul? That's in Matthew. But so I started to question those issues and started to realize that my past behaviors were not simply mistakes, but they were actually sinful, an affront to an almighty God. And that it was a denial of the righteousness of his laws. But that was one part of this parallel path I was taking, thinking about those things, reading the scripture, what it has to say. Some of the stumbling blocks had to do with science.
Okay.
And also with respect to the issue of abortion. So science, being a scientist, I thought I was pursuing the truth. And so I thought, well, hasn't science disproved many of the assertions of Christianity? And I didn't have a full-blown understanding of science, and the book talks about that long journey whereby I revisited the philosophy of science and ultimately came to the conclusion, based on atheistic philosophers of science and what they wrote and their arguments and their analysis, is that science can't actually provide you with the truth. It actually gives you a series of rules and algorithms and things of that nature by which to tie the observations that we have about the world together. And that's the theory. And then the theory can be supported by evidences, but can never actually be proven. So that's what I ultimately came to realize. But at the time, with a very immature understanding, one of my mentors said, well, ultimately, you can't do a scientific experiment on the world with God and do another controlled experiment without God. So you can't, it's really beyond proof in that sense. You can't really do a scientific experiment with and without God. A little bit satisfying that, oh, okay, well, gosh, if I think about it, yeah, that's the case. But then some of your listeners might have heard of Josh McDowell, who wrote Evidence That Demands a Verdict, and he has other books like Skeptics. I think those are books about skeptics.
When skeptics ask,
or something like that, or reasons for skeptics to consider. And so there are some historical things that are really interesting to think about, and he also had some scientific things that are a little bit hard to explain if you just assume what the atheists are telling you is the case. And so in my journey later on, even though I had this fundamental idea about the philosophy of science, well, I can't prove anything. Okay, but it's still interesting as what we would call a counter argument, a counter argument that you assume that science, has some evidence, but you find that there's a counter evidence. There's something else that actually seems to go against the prevailing wisdom about evolution and so on and so forth. So
it's really concerning, actually, how much our culture and just students these days just take whatever the science class says and they say, well, that must be true, right?
That's correct. Yes.
We find that in a lot of different areas. And one of them was in carbon dating that you mentioned in your book.
Yes.
Why don't you share a little bit about that? Because so many times we hear, oh, well, it must be this old because they carbon dated it.
Correct.
Well, not so fast.
That's right. So just talking about carbon dating by itself without reference to the philosophy of science, but taken at face value, carbon dating assumes that there was a certain amount of radioactive carbon in the atmosphere at a certain time in the past, and that mixture of the radioactive and the non-radioactive carbon was fixed. So then when an animal dies, there's a certain ratio in their bodies, and then now for hundreds, thousands of years, that ratio changes, and then based on what it is now, you can kind of backtrack to to what you thought it was, and then decide how many years old it is.
So what you're saying is, if carbon dating has this element and has a half-life, and we measure that half-life based on that amount and that half-life, then you must be having this many years back.
Correct.
Right? And what you're saying is, well, that would work if everything was fixed, but we don't know if it was fixed.
That's right. Where were you, say, 50,000 years ago when the animal was alive or just about to die? And do you actually know what the ratio of that radiocarbon to the normal carbon was in the atmosphere at the time? You make an assumption that that's what it was based on whatever measurements you make now or in the rocks or whatever. How do you even know that rock was actually that old? And then you also have to make the assumption that the rate of decay is uniform, that it follows that half-life that we just talked about, and that nothing speeds it up or slows it down. Okay, so those are two major assumptions, or that nothing got introduced. Right?
Sure.
That's all there was, and there wasn't like some particle that that rock or something. There's some diffusion or something. Can't get into all those details, and probably there will be scientists out there say, well, that can't happen, that can't happen. Well, how do you know that those things can't happen?
In other words, if it was in a box that was temperature controlled, it was locked, nothing else could get in or out, and we studied the half-life and knew that it was uniform, then maybe you can agree with that, right?
Correct. And we do that now in certain scientific experiments. We'll use the decay of P32 or decay of carbon or decay of hydrogen and try to backtrack. But that's controlled experiments done now in a matter of days, months, years. So interestingly, I would also point out that Bertrand Russell, who's an atheist, actually did say that there's no argument that you can make against the idea, however ludicrous he thinks it might be, but he actually said that you can't actually make an argument against the idea that the world has only been in existence for 5 minutes, and that all of your memories beyond 5 minutes are just memories.
Sure.
That somebody introduced or something happened, but you have no way of actually proving that.
Yeah.
And so that's a larger kind of philosophical perspective. But the problem with science, with all those assumptions that we just made, is that this is why in science your arguments and your conclusions are always tentative. You would say something like, these results suggest that my hypothesis may be true. Because if you look at the philosophy of science, there's a hypothesis, you're doing the experiment to try to figure out something about the hypothesis. You can never actually say that you've proved it. The logical situation is such, I won't bore you with that, the logical situation is such that you can't actually ever say that you've proved it. You can say that maybe you've disproved it, and you can say that I've left that hypothesis standing, so the results suggest that this is the correct result. Some other things to think about would be that any finite number of observations can be supported by an infinite number of hypotheses. So there's an infinite number of possible explanations for the observations that you have. And you're just trying to do some experiments to try to hopefully narrow that down. But ultimately, all you can do is say that this hypothesis remains standing, and I don't have conclusive proof for it, but it suggests that may be true.
It's fascinating to talk about that and realize that many of the things that are taught really need to be investigated further. Don't just take it at face value, but really investigate it further. And I think it is easy for someone to remain an atheist or not believe in God if they don't do that. If they just take everything at face value, what they're told, then it could be easy to do that and try and live a good life, try and live your best life. but that's not what we're ultimately talking about here.
Correct.
What was the defining moment for you where you finally started to realize I'm no longer going to be following the philosophies of Ayn Rand, and you start to realize the Bible is probably true and you want to have a relationship with God? Tell me about that.
Yeah. So I mentioned that I was on these parallel tracks. I mentioned the philosophy, the reading of scripture, science. I also mentioned abortion very briefly, and I was never a participant in abortion or anything like that. But at some point I said, well, gosh, this is such a stumbling block for me because Ayn Rand advocated abortion. And this is going to sound like, you're just repeating what your guru wants you to believe, but it seemed like it was consistent with her philosophy. So I said, well, you know what? I'd like to go see a birth. So I did actually arrange for myself to go see a birth as a first year. That's usually not the time you go see a birth. And
you're in medical school.
In medical school, yeah, first year of medical school. So I had some connections, and I managed to be able to go see a birth. And then the lady who was in labor obviously consented to have a medical student observe. And it was pretty amazing. And then, the baby comes out, takes a breath, and it goes from being kind of pale blue to pink. And then I just had to think about the first issue that was raging in society at that time, which was partial birth abortion, which is that you can deliver the head and kill the baby just because the rest of the body is still inside the mom's body. And so it was impactful in terms of just seeing, well, I don't think that's right. I don't think that the woman gets to just decide that this life can be terminated. I think this is a real life. I think so at the very least, kind of this late term kind of abortion idea, it just seemed like it was not something I could support. I mean, if you want observational evidence, you want to look at the baby, how do you deny that this is a life? So that wasn't the critical point, but it was like some of the other issues that were going on at the same time. I was dealing with all three at the same time. But I think finally it's just like all these things about science and about abortion and other issues in my life and whether I've truly sinned. You just the message of the gospel resonated. That's why we have to preach the gospel, because you don't necessarily do things in order to make a sinful person feel good. I mean, they have to come to the recognition that they're a sinner and that they actually need a perfect Savior. They need the perfect Savior who died for them, whose perfect record of righteousness, his perfect life is credited to them. God sees his son, his perfect son, Jesus Christ, when he's believed on by the sinner, and he sees that record of perfect righteousness, and he doesn't account to the individual their sin. Because before you believe in Christ or after you believe in Christ, you're still going to sin. You might be better. You might recognize some of God's laws, and you're going to try to start doing them because you recognize that to be the truth, but you'll always be imperfect at it. So there's this total dependence upon God's mercy through Jesus Christ that is necessary for one to have eternal life. And so I came to that point. There was probably a sinner's prayer or something like that in the back of a book somewhere that I was able to read and truly believe and confess with my heart and believe that, Jesus is Lord, God raised him from the dead. And that was the moment. Sometime in February of 1989.
Okay.
Second semester of medical school. And what was interesting was that, sometimes you do question like, okay, well, did I just say something, but I didn't really believe it. But what was interesting was that I was actually able to forgive somebody who had hurt me years before that. And so, when God's love has been shed abroad in your heart through faith, and you see the evidence of that. I mean, I'm not saying I was perfect
Sure.
by any means, but that was like one piece of evidence that God was able to give me.
You knew something had changed.
Yeah.
Something
That's right.
drastic had changed, because normally you would not forgive that person.
Right.
And so you knew that God was doing work in your heart. He was moving you to do things that you perhaps would not have done before. And that kind of crescendo was when you forgave this person.
That's right. I mean, in your own selfishness, if you were still abiding with Ayn Rand's philosophy, you would just keep saying that you're not going to forgive, you know. So so that was good. It was something that stayed with me, even as I continued to navigate my way to to what God had for me for the next years. So
it's really a fascinating journey and fascinating book. I can just see it's like a slow story of God softening your heart.
that's right.
Right? He's just it was kind of like you were about me and about what I want to do in my direction, kind of everyone get out of my way, that kind of thinking. And then these different stories about, working on the cadaver. Where is this person? Or being on the airplane. What happens to me when I die?
That's right.
Or seeing that baby born and going, this isn't making sense that you could kill something so precious and alive.
Right.
Right?
Right.
And then when you accepted him into your heart and you began to see that heart change, it's really an awesome story of seeing him just love you towards him, soften your heart, change your views. And it's a process, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And, you're not fully armed and, with perfect knowledge. And so it was a process. And there were lots of Christians at Harvard who helped me along. Sometimes people refer to Harvard as godless Harvard. But there were people in the graduate school, Christian fellowship, and the medical school, Christian Medical and Dental Society that were helpful. None of us were perfect. I mean, kind of got nurtured along, but I had some good friends who were good models. And so just a little bit by little, I was able to mature.
Michael, thank you so much for sharing your journey and how you are following the philosophies of Ayn Rand, how God started to work in your heart and soften it, how you accepted him into your heart. Tell us about this book, Reconsidering Ayn Rand, and why you wrote it.
After I became a Christian, one of the things that most new Christians think about is, well, how can I serve God? What's my purpose now? So I was in medical school. I still wanted to be a doctor. But some of those priorities changed. And one of the thoughts that came to my mind was that, okay, well, I've learned so much, maybe I can write about it. And put a book together, kind of a work of apologetics, kind of like I like the fact that somebody like Josh McDowell took the time to put some stuff together. It wasn't 100% correct, but it was enough to help somebody, down the right pathway to think about it in their own personal journey. So I thought I could maybe put something together. And that first summer, I had a little bit of time, and I thought, oh, I could just write this in 2 seconds. but no, I couldn't finish it in the first summer. There was no way. And so I worked on it bits and pieces. I was busy in medical school, and then time came for internship, and you get busier and busier. You have lots of duties. And by the time that I was halfway through residency in ophthalmology, and by the way, I chose ophthalmology in part because I thought, as brilliant as people were in ophthalmology, as wonderful the work was, I thought I would have a little bit more time compared to neurosurgery, which was my initial interest, to actually write a book. So here I was starting to prioritize the book over even my choice of a specialty. And so by the second year of residency, it's a 3-year program, I thought, I'm not going to get this done. I've been reading. I just realized I had to do more reading on the various topics, and it's just not going to get done. And so I finally decided to ask for a year off because I felt like, well, if I get busy in my practice after I graduate or have a family, that I wouldn't be able to do it. So I just asked for a year off between residency and fellowship training. Fellowship is advanced training in your chosen specialty. So I chose pediatric ophthalmology, and so, but who's going to give me a year off? Because I'm nobody, as far as I could tell. And why would anybody give you, it's hard enough to just ask to get into a fellowship. So fortunately, I was very fortunate. I did ask on faith. And my mentors at University of Michigan gave me a year off. So between residency and fellowship, I did just day and night. I mean, basically I was working on the book, and I learned a lot, did a lot of research, and I finished the book in about 6 to 9 months. And then I did my fellowship the following year, but I was able to finish it, and then it took another couple of years to get it published. But yeah, so it's an ever expanding process. I mean, you do a little bit of research and you realize that you don't know nearly as much as you thought you knew. And then you got to go down that track and figure it out a little bit further. And so I was very fortunate. And actually there was a Christian, it's an interesting story. There was another Christian who had written a book about Ayn Rand. And the book is called Without a Prayer. It's by a gentleman named John Robbins. He's passed away years ago. But interestingly, to show you that, that what you said earlier was true, which is that the atheists, I'm not going to say every atheist, but some atheists don't really want to explore because they just assume that what they've been told is correct because that's kind of what they prefer. So they prefer that because they might feel deep in their heart that if they explore, they might find something a little bit different. Yeah. So when I was in high school, I actually wrote a term paper on Ayn Rand. And I thought I was a good writer, but one of the comments from my 10th grade teacher was that, well, all your references are from Ayn Rand. Do you have anything from anybody other than Ayn Rand, like a counter argument? And so I didn't. But there was this gentleman who was an objectivist. That's what they call themselves, people who believe in Ayn Rand's philosophy. He had a couple of books on Ayn Rand that were criticisms of her writing. And one of them was, I remember William O'Neill from University of Southern California. It's called With Charity Towards None. The other one was Answer to Ayn Rand by John Robbins, and he's a Christian. And I remember he loaned those two books to me, and this gentleman and I looked at them, and within the first 15, 20, 30 pages of Answer to Ayn Rand, and to a lesser extent the other book, I just felt my heart was sinking because he was bringing up all these contradictions within her philosophy. And I was starting to realize, well, maybe he's right. But then there was this part of me that just didn't want to, I think I looked up a couple of those things, but I didn't really delve into them.
I'm good. I don't want to hear that.
I don't really want to hear that. And so I think listeners need to realize that there is a defense mechanism. No matter how smart somebody appears to be, no matter how with it they seem to be, no matter how many books they thought they've read, and these are highfalutin, intellectuals that they've read, they're just human. And there is this sin that people have, and then they want to suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Some of them are maybe very militant, and other people are just poor souls that you should have compassion towards. And I was suppressing the truth in unrighteousness, I think, because this system protected me against some of the negative experiences I had in high school. And so you do what you can to kind of keep it up. Now, years later, I think God softened my heart, as you mentioned, and I was more willing to look at stuff that I had tried to ignore previously. Okay. So, but part of that process was to go back and look at critiques written by other people, whether they're Christians or not. And I found that book, Answer to Ayn Rand, in one of the Harvard libraries, and I was able to look at it, and I remembered reading it previously and not liking it, but now I embraced it in terms of like trying to learn from it. So there was a lot of learning in the process. I mean, both in terms of the material, the contents, whether it's philosophy of science, philosophy of history, morality. I just had to really, really gain an understanding of those things before I could actually write. But there's also sharpening of my own writing abilities. And so, so it was a long process. It took about 8 years off and on through internship, residency, and then a couple of more years to actually ultimately get it published. So, yeah.
So, Michael, you have this great story. I want you to share it with our audience. When God tells us to do something, when he lays something on our heart, there's a purpose, and we need to follow him. And I want them to just be encouraged by your story on why. Tell us about this great story.
Yeah, I mean, to back up a little bit, when I first started writing the book, I didn't know what impact it would have, if any. I was of the opinion that, well, if 8 people read it or 800 people read it, I'm called to write this book and finish it. I just feel I have to do this, and then I'll go on with my life. It was almost like that. So I just followed what I felt was the call. And I will probably never see all of the, the impact of, and probably most people, if they're influenced by it, they're not going to necessarily reach out to me. But there was an interesting story. I was once in New Orleans, and there was this church I went to when I was visiting that city for a meeting. And I talked to the pastor afterwards, and it turned out he went to my high school. He was a year ahead of me. I didn't know him back then. But as we talked, and we talked about, this book too, he mentioned that, he remembers seeing me. And he would kind of recognize I was kind of lonely, and he didn't come and talk to me or anything. He would, we're all immature at, even if we're Christians, we don't necessarily know. We got to go out and reach out to somebody who seems to be hurting. But he would throw up a prayer for me. So then I said, oh, okay, and I talked to him about it, and I mentioned I wrote this book. And then it turns out that he goes home, maybe talks to his brother, and then his brother realizes that he has my book. He was an Ayn Rand devotee. His older brother was an Ayn Rand devotee and had read my book independently of his younger brother, the one that met me in New Orleans. And so we meet later, and it turns out, it seems that my book had an impact on his life. In terms of potentially reversing, maybe some of the negative impacts of Ayn Rand's views. I've mentioned them. I have no idea which areas he struggled with, but it impacted him, and he had a copy that he had seemed well worn. He had read and marked up, and so it's kind of interesting how God weaves our stories together.
Absolutely. It's just so awesome, like you were saying, how God weaves our stories together, and how he motivated this young man to pray for you, and he saw that you needed something else in your life, even while you were yet unsaved. And then you become saved, and you're motivated to share all these things that you've learned in your book, and it ends up helping his brother through a tough time that he was going through.
That's right.
And it's just like God to do that, to weave our stories together in such a beautiful way.
That's right.
So I have a lot of respect for you, Michael, and your book. And what we want to just say to our atheist friends who are watching right now, and people who are fans of Ayn Rand, is we get it. We understand how you can be reasonable and follow those philosophies, and also follow that thought process. Why don't you just share with us a little bit about how some of that is reasonable, but ultimately where it leads?
Thanks, Daniel. So in terms of respect, we've previously talked about these high achieving characters like Francisco d'Anconia. And so we get why people want to achieve. They want to accomplish great things in their lives. A second area in which Ayn Rand devotees are attracted to her philosophy would be the area of romantic love. She has these amazing relationships that she depicts in her books. In Atlas Shrugged, you have Francisco d'Anconia and Dagny Taggart, and John Galt. And so people aspire to that. They think, gosh, if I follow this philosophy, ultimately I will find the right type of person. I will find another person who's high achieving, and we can have this wonderful life together. And so the fiction really is an ideal for them to aspire to. And in fact, some of the hints in the book talk about this chivalry in love. For example, there's this fellow named Sebastian d'Anconia, who's one of Francisco's forefathers, and he waited 15 years for his loved one, and she had waited for him. So there's this, wonderful sense of like this can be achieved, and one can aspire for this ideal in romantic love. However, there are some things that kind of take away from that, because remember, her philosophy is about the sensation of pleasure and pain. And that's in there a little bit on a higher level, in that you're supposed to pursue the person that is of the highest type, whether that's somebody who's the highest type in terms of intellect or physical beauty. And you pursue this person because otherwise you would be a person with poor self-image, right? Only a person who's of high self-esteem would not permit him or herself to settle for somebody who's not that highest type. But by the same token, what happens when you pick somebody? If you pick somebody, do you stop your search for the highest type of a person? Or do you keep looking?
That's interesting.
You know, it's a contradiction, I think, that's in the system where there's this nobility and love, but then can you stop and settle on that nobility and love? Or do you find somebody else or be on the prowl or have an eye out for something else? So the question is whether somebody can actually stop after they found the highest type of person that they want to spend their lives with, or whether they should continue to be on the lookout for something that comes along that might be better. One would think not with some of the stories in there about people waiting for each other for 15 years, let's say. But on the other hand, you look at the life of Dagny Taggart, and Francisco d'Anconia left her in order to pursue the strike that his friend John Galt had come up with, where they would resist the intrusions of the government and the society. But he doesn't give her an explanation. And then so what's she left with? So she has to look around and she has to find somebody that she can aspire to be with. And one person would be this fellow named Hank Reardon. But then she goes kind of serially from one person to another, not satisfied with that one person, because ultimately Hank Reardon isn't the highest type. And so she winds up with John Galt, who is the consummate hero in the story, and he is the highest type. But then, so she doesn't actually do this thing where she waits 15 years for Francisco d'Anconia. She just kind of goes from one person to another that was available to her. And so in other places, Ayn Rand has said that whether somebody chooses to have a marriage or to have an affair is left up to the individuals, as long as they pursue it with a serious intent. You know, so, but one person's idea of serious is another person's idea of flippant.
Right.
You know, so it might cut down the number of partners one has over a lifetime if one is serious, but in principle, it's kind of up to the individual to not strive to make something permanent, as would be the case with Christian marriage. So while on the one hand, you know, we can see some of the good things in her writings, she undermines it by other aspects of her writing and other stories that's embedded in her fiction.
Tell us a little bit about your book and who you feel would be a great fit for this.
So the young person who's just getting started in defense of the faith may benefit from reading this. I've distilled some of the best information provided by apologists that are out there. And so hopefully that provides a model for folks to kind of put their thinking cap on and to try to compare different methods and how one reasons with a non-believer.
It's great. So whether you're an atheist or a Christian, you can get something out of this book, can't you? There's a lot of different arguments in there, apologetics, and then your story too, on how you really went through that process and became a Christian. It's a great read.
Thank you.
Tell us, Dr. Young, where can they get the book?
Yeah, they can get this book at Amazon.com or at eBay. There are sellers that still sell this book. And then also the trinityfoundation.org would be places where they could find a copy of this book.
Awesome. Well, it's been a blessing having you here, Dr. Young, sharing your life story with us, how you came to know Jesus, and then your journey as well, and so much about this awesome book, Reconsidering Ayn Rand. I just want to thank you for coming in today. It's been great having you in the studio, and I hope people go and pick up the book because it's an awesome read.
Thank you, Daniel. It's been a pleasure being here.
Thank you so much for joining us today with Dr. Michael Young and the book, Reconsidering Ayn Rand. My name is Daniel, and this is The Narrow Road Home.